Hi, I'm Angela Cross. I'm a tax partner working out of the Northwest region for BDO. I've worked in the social housing sector supporting our clients in that area for over 20 years now, and support them with their tax and planning around the tax issues that come to light. We've also joined by Simon from PA Housing Group, who is here today to talk to us following the release of the Social Housing Barometer Survey that came out quite recently. I'll let Simon introduce himself to you rather than me doing that.
Thanks, Angela. Good afternoon. So I'm the Resources Director at PA Housing. So my remit here covers finance, HR, IT, all those other bits. So I've worked for PA for 5 years, but I've worked in the social housing sector for over 25 years now.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks for joining us today. So as you know, BDO has released the Social Housing Barometer results, and that's given us a really great flavour for the issues affecting the sector, the opportunities, and what you see as important within the social housing arena. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the topics that came out of that survey were actually true across the board, most of the clients that we surveyed. However, there are obviously some regional differences in that. There always are, and it's what we'd expect. The social housing sector is very wide and very varied. But Simon, I'd be interested to hear your views on the major themes that were coming out of that survey and how you relate to them in your role at PA Housing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are actually a multi-regional housing provider. So we have stock in the East Midlands, in London and Surrey. So we do get different perspectives from that spread of stock across our geography. But for me, the most interesting things this year from the report that you've issued, there's a really strong theme around the wider economic uncertainty and the choppy waters that we now are entering into. And that's, both from a business and a resident's perspective, and we have to really take a balanced view of the two. So on the business side, lots of cost pressures out there, the big ticket items around fire safety, which is a priority for us at the moment. The emerging carbon neutral agenda, clearly very important for the sector as a whole. And then more generally, the supply chain issues that we're facing in certain key areas are coming to pass. But again, for our residents, they're facing many of those same pressures. We've all heard about the utility costs going through the roof in recent weeks and months, petrol pump prices increasing as well, food prices increasing. And, we heard just earlier this week that the latest inflation figures have shown another big jump up for November. So that short-term cost of living pressure for residents will be with us for a time as well, I think. So really interesting time for boards to be juggling those two priorities. And I think, we have to make sure that we don't lose sight of what we're all here to achieve as a sector. We're not in the private sector. And I think we do have a duty of care in the broadest sense to do the right thing by residents, but equally, we need to make decisions that ensure that we have the capacity to continue investing in essential services and in our homes through to the longer term. So that was one really strong thing. And the second was around the emerging ESG agenda, which has really increased in prevalence, I think, for the sector over the past 12 months. And we are one of a number of housing associations who've issued bonds over the past year with an ESG badge attached to them, which we found was, first of all, a very interesting process to go through, but also very beneficial at launch of the bond. And it landed very well with investors. And over the past 12, 18 months, we've really developed our thinking around ESG, what it means to us, how we report on it to the wider world, and how we take it on to the next level. And that's starting to emerge, I think, in the survey that you've done this year as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the bond that you issued, why did you choose to go for the sustainable bond?
Well, I think in simple terms, we saw the way the wind was blowing. So going back over the past 2 or 3 years, there's been a gradual creep of ESG related issuance to the capital markets. I think, working with our advisors as we prepared for the bond issue, we saw that a tipping point was coming. And in the very near future, we expected it to become very much the norm, as opposed to the exception, that bond issuance would be ESG related in some way. So we started our preparations probably around this time last year in earnest for going to the market on that basis. And we did some work to set up an ESG framework, which we published shortly before the bond issue. within which we've gone public in terms of some of the key metrics that we want to measure to prove our ESG credentials to stakeholders. And then beyond that, we're looking at how we can start to embed other strands of ESG within our day-to-day activities as well. And I think on that, for the sector, the one that's always in the headlines is the E, the environmental aspect of ESG, particularly thinking around carbon neutral and sustainability as a long-term goal for the sector. Of course, that's very important to us, but we also want to focus on the other aspects of ESG as well. So to give an example of that, we've just completed work on a new equality, diversity and inclusion strategy, which really tries to place EDI at the heart of business decision making and to permeate across everything that we do. And I think that's going to take us another step forward in terms of some of those G&S bits of ESG as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It definitely is the E aspect of the ESG agenda that gets the headlines. And it's great that you've got a strategy. I think lots of the organisations that were surveyed for the Social Housing Barometer aren't quite as far forward in their thought processes on that as you are. So that's brilliant. How are you doing in terms of measuring against your objectives? Because sometimes with this sort of thing, it can be quite difficult to measure, can't it?
Yeah, and I think it is still a work in progress for the sector. So some of the new measures around carbon emissions are still quite a novelty factor for us that we need to get our head around. So we have signed up to the sector reporting standard framework, which a number of bond issuers have also signed up to. So there's consistency in reporting there. And we released our first year-end results against those metrics for the 2020-21 financial year. So that report was published back end of the summer, just gone. Beyond that, of course, as I mentioned, we have within our own sustainability framework a number of other metrics that we want to measure against. So this coming year end, now that we've issued the bond, we'll start to report on those as well. And what we're also hoping to do is begin bringing in some benchmarking information. So looking at others who have reported on the same basis under that reporting framework, comparing our performance to them to see where we're either stronger or where we need to do more work to get up to speed. So I think that discipline around benchmarking will start to move the agenda forward for the sector as well in future years.
Yeah, okay. And another interesting point that came out of the survey for me was around the cost of carbon neutrality in particular, and how organisations had measured that, or in fact, in some cases, not measured it as of yet. How do you see that playing out in terms of additional costs for your organisation?
Yeah, I was interested to see actually within your survey results, there was quite a wide disparity of responses on this question, wasn't there? And some respondents felt that the impact would be more at the margins. Now, I think we're at the more significant end of the scale in terms of our expectations. We got in early with providing a provision within our 2020 business plan around the journey towards carbon neutral. At that stage, it was very much based on just a high-level estimate, taking data that was available within the sector. And from that, we came to a total figure of something around £230 million across the long term out to 2050, which we provided for within our business plan. Now, since then, we've been undertaking work to pare down that high-level estimate into a more detailed assessment and initial action plan. And we invested in some specialist software, which helps us to interrogate the data we hold around the properties, the condition they're in and where they're located and how old they are, those sorts of things, from which we're drawing up the first phase of getting on with it. So that number I mentioned, 230 million, will undoubtedly change, but we think it's a reasonable first attempt at estimating the long-term costs within the business plan. And for us, as I say, it's a significant number. It does mean that we'll have less capacity longer term to do other things, but clearly it's an essential priority for the nation as a whole. So we need to play our part in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And big numbers that we're talking about, isn't it? With a group, especially the size of yours. So good that you're on with having established what the potential cost of that is. And I think in terms of the social housing space generally, there's always been a focus on the S aspect of ESG. It's part of your makeup as an organisation. I do think that we need to push that further within that space as part of the ESG agenda, but that's probably the strongest area. I think from my perspective, it's definitely the E and the G that probably requires the attention most across the board. So we've spoken about the other two aspects. What about the G in all that? Where are you up to from that perspective?
Yeah, I think you're right, really. First of all, on the S piece of it, we do a lot of work in that space. It's what we're here to achieve. But I think as a sector, having worked here for 25 years, we've never been very good at telling the wider world what that actually means. So if you look at some of the stuff that we do at PA, which is by no means unique, but about financial inclusion, we've got a very well-established tenancy sustainment team, which helps residents to understand their financial position when they're struggling and gives them access to benefits. And that helps a number of people every year. We do work with budding entrepreneurs to get them started with setting up their own businesses and provide training, support, advice around that. And there's a number of projects like that that we all do, but we don't often explain to the wider audience out there that this is part of what being a housing association is all about. And sometimes we fall into the trap of being perceived as just a landlord, I think, but the offering is more than that. On the G side, I think we are very aware there that we have a number of stakeholder needs to meet, and we have to make sure that our arrangements around how we run the business are watertight, are very tightly controlled, and are in line with evolving best practice. So certainly our board is very, very keen to make sure that as they go along, we're always taking advice from external experts in terms of what that best practice looks like. As I mentioned earlier around equality, diversity and inclusion, and that's something which is at the forefront of our board's mind. So in governance terms, how do we truly make sure that we're representing the communities that we're trying to work with? And that's both in terms of the protected characteristics within law, but also more broadly, do we have a board membership and a senior leadership team which understands the lives that our residents lead? So lived experience of social housing, levels of educational attainment, social class as a background, family background, those sorts of questions we're starting to ask ourselves now. And over the past 18 months, as an example of that, we've introduced for the first time 2 resident board member posts. So those residents now sit directly on the main board and have input into strategic decisions, which I think is a good step forward. It goes well beyond that in terms of the governance arrangements across the organisation.
Yeah. And in terms of the ESG agenda, just before we move on to other topics within the barometer, will you be looking for the same characteristics in your suppliers going forward?
Absolutely, and that's one of the 4 pillars of our new ESG BDI strategy. So looking at how we partner with suppliers to make sure they're coming from the same viewpoint as us, and perhaps getting a little bit more assertive and forceful in those relationships. So I think in the past it's been a bit of a tick box exercise at procurement stage. You ask the right questions and you ask them to produce their policies and that sort of thing. Once that's done, people tend to forget about it. I think we want to be a much more proactive player in that space now. So we want to work with people who truly have the same values as we do around this agenda, and we can exploit then opportunities with them to make use of that within communities that we serve. So there's lots of stuff we can do together with our suppliers to add value beyond the core purpose of the contracts that we have with them, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing more and more questions around that when we're attending pitches and proposals. Like you say, I think it used to be provide us your policy on it. We had a policy on it, but more and more we're being interrogated as part of the onboarding and the interview process, which is what you'd expect, given that ESG is so prominent in not only in the social housing sector, but in the wider world as well. So yeah, I've definitely seen a shift, I think, in terms of focus. So the other things that you talked about at the outset, so one of those was health and safety, and in particular with regard to fire safety. So is that one of the top risks within the organisation? Is that where the focus is?
Yeah, building safety in general, absolutely one of the top risks. So something we're very, very keen to make sure we have a full understanding of, and our board monitors that at every board meeting. Within that, fire safety in itself for us is a significant area of cost. It's probably moved beyond the risk stage now because it's crystallised. So we know we have a few estates, a relatively small number, but a few estates where we need to spend a fair amount of money to remediate historic imperfections in the work that was done when the properties were constructed. And the intrusive surveys that we've done have shown that those properties are not compliant with what the standards now are. So we have to go back in and redo that work. And so that cost again is coming into our financial planning now, which causes certainly some short-term volatility. It's probably fair to say around our metrics, but we've worked very proactively with our lenders and our investors to make sure that they understand the journey that we're on with that. And that's been a good example actually of positive partnership working. They get it, and they know that we want to make sure these properties are put right for the residents that live in them. And they've been able to show the flexibility that we've been asking for to accommodate that spend within our financial planning.
And as we look at the survey more generally, that was definitely one of the top risks, if not the top risk, that came out across the board that organisations were looking at. And again, it's great that it's an area of focus and that you've got those targets and strategies. In terms of time frame for that, is this something that you think will span the next 2 to 3 years, or is it's more likely to be longer term than that?
Well, you can probably split it into 2 phases. So the initial phase is to put right the things that we know aren't right at the moment in terms of specific buildings where we have an issue. And that's the work we want to complete as quickly as possible, subject to liaising with contractors and the legal niceties and that sort of thing. So that's roughly a 2-year time frame from now. We're hoping to get all that work put in place and completed so the residents know they're living in a home which is meeting modern day standards. But beyond that, it's absolutely a much longer term thing operationally. So we'll have embedded within our cost base permanently I think more resources around building safety. And the environment that we're working within continues to evolve. Legislation is still emerging on this, so we need to be conversant with that as it comes into the public domain, and we'll need to adapt our cost base accordingly. So it will definitely be a long-term thing operationally.
Yeah, and it's obviously one of the key concerns for the residents as well. We've heard a lot about it in the press. Yep. So what have you done in terms of communicating your strategy to the residents, and what was the feedback that you've had from them?
Well, we've done what we need to in terms of reassuring them that we're doing everything we can to keep the buildings safe. So where necessary in the short term, we've put in place waking watch arrangements. We've also invested in additional facilities which can be relatively quick to put in, like enhanced sprinkler systems and that sort of thing, enhanced alarm systems. So that's given them the reassurance that we are trying to look after them while the more major work is working through the pipeline. And I think they've responded well to that. Clearly there's some concern out there, but they've taken us at our word that we're trying to work as quickly as possible to put these things right, and they're working with us. So it's been a positive relationship with the residents, and we continue to try to keep them informed as we get to various staging points within the journey. So there's a regular update loop there for them.
Yeah, I think communication's key in that, isn't it, to bring the residents with you and to reassure them, like you say. Okay, so in terms of some other things then that came out in the barometer, one was development, and that came from both an opportunity perspective, but also in terms of some of the challenges that the sector has faced over the last 2 years in terms of development. So could you just tell us a little bit about the strategy at PA Housing and whether that has changed given recent events?
Our strategy hasn't materially changed. I think we've always tried to steer a fairly steady, cautious, long-term path on developments. So first and foremost, we're really interested in developing new social housing, be that either rented or shared ownership. We don't really get involved in other tenures. So we try to stick to what we're good at and what we're here to achieve. So that's naturally brings an element of stability into our planning. We're less exposed to other market forces at play there. Certainly in the short term through COVID, we did see some significant impacts on the pace of development. So things pretty much ground to a halt for a period of time initially, and then once developers were back on site, the rate of work was at a slower pace than we had before due to the social distancing rules that they had to introduce and that sort of thing. And to an extent that's still the case, so we're not running at the same levels of capacity as we were pre-COVID, but we haven't altered our long-term plan. Again, I think the board, looking at the long-term financial planning that we have, the board's got a watchful eye beyond the immediate issues. So yes, within the short term, things have got a bit choppy, but then when you get beyond the next couple of years, they can see that the longer term forecast is much more stable based on the current assumptions that we have. And of course, we don't know how the wider economy will evolve and that sort of thing, and we do the stress testing around that. But the longer term outlook is much more stable for us. So the board hasn't seen the need to significantly change its growth plans. So we're planning to build 6,000 homes over 10 years out to 2030, which is roughly around a 2 to 2.5% growth rate per annum for us. So it's nothing particularly aggressive, and it's designed in that way so that we can withstand any of these short-term shocks that come in, such as we've experienced over the past 18 months or so.
Yeah, you're probably better equipped than some, I would say, from that perspective in terms of your strategies and your growth planning. Have you been impacted by supply chain problems and I suppose resourcing on the ground as well? I know in my world it's impossible to get a builder to do anything this time before next Christmas. So are the same sort of things that are happening in the sector?
Yeah, it's a bit like the old Soviet Union, isn't it? Booking a plumber years from now. But yes, to an extent, yes. So it hasn't been widespread though so far. So it's been more isolated and specific schemes having problems at certain periods of time. So there have been intermittent issues around labour supply on site, and there have been delays with obtaining certain key materials and components at times as well. But it hasn't been a consistent, sustained message in that respect. So we're seeing individual schemes face a period of disruption, but then overcoming that and then working towards completion, and that pattern then repeats elsewhere. So far it's been a bit more limited, but I think it's probably going to get a little bit worse before it gets better, is my prediction there.
Yeah, I suspect you're right. And have the costs gone up accordingly?
Yes, costs have gone up, but more in terms of the future programme. So the stuff we have on site at the moment, that the costs of the contracts are nailed down, and there's been relatively little pushback from the contractors around that actually, so they're just getting on with it. But it's when we're looking at the next phase of the development program, so the stuff that we are, the sites we're acquiring now, we're appraising those, we're finding that the costs of those are higher than we had, within our appraisals a year or two back. So the longer term cost outlook is absolutely higher.
Yeah. Okay. One of the other things that came out of the barometer survey was in terms of opportunities for development, and finding the right ones are becoming increasingly tougher to find, whether that is with regard to finding land or the requirement for the specific types of development, I guess, that were in the growth plans of organisations. Is that something that you've found as well?
I wouldn't say we have particularly, no. I think we're still finding opportunities relatively plentiful. We try to maintain strong relations with a number of key local authorities and contractors, and we're finding that through those relationships we're still getting quite a lot of potential schemes to look at. Now, not all of those are viable, and we'll dismiss them fairly quickly, but in terms of building up the pipeline beyond the current programme on site, that's been quite healthy for us over the past 12 months. So, in very round numbers, we've got about 1,000 homes on site at the moment. But then we've got an approved pipeline of another 1,500 behind that of schemes which are, ready to go once we get to that stage. So for us, it's been more positive over the past year, 18 months. Most of our growth is focused in outer London, particularly South London, and into Surrey. And our strategy has always been to look for smaller to medium sites as opposed to large multi-tenure sites. So we do tend to pepper pot and scatter around as a mitigation strategy. And that seems to be working quite well for us at the moment.
Excellent. And are you finding that you're being approached more and more to enter into joint ventures with other partners?
Again, not particularly. I think broadly speaking, we're satisfying our growth plan through the more traditional routes in terms of either land-led or Section 106 opportunities. Joint venture does pop up from time to time in discussions, but we haven't done any of those yet. And again, that probably speaks to the size of the site that we're looking at, that we probably tend to operate in a sweet spot which is slightly below that which would justify any sort of joint venture arrangements. Yeah. We do have one very large strategic site in West London that's moving forward, but that's more of a partnership than a joint venture, which we're working with the local authority on to the market. So that's a key project for us, but again, it's contracted on more traditional grounds.
Okay, that's one of the reasons that I asked the question, is partly from a development perspective, but also one of the other points that came out from the survey was that organisations and the board are increasingly prepared to take more risk than they have been historically. So hence, I guess, the question about joint ventures. So outside of the development arena, would you say that was true of PA Housing, or is it status quo for now?
Yeah, broadly speaking, our board tends to be, as I mentioned before, in terms of growth plan, quite cautious, relatively risk averse, and we stick to the core social housing product. So we don't get involved in diverse activities. And I wouldn't say that the risk appetite has particularly increased over the past 12, 18 months. It's more or less where it was before. I think the board, as I mentioned before, prefers to take a longer term view and steer a steady path through short term choppy waters, and that's the approach that's generally served us well so far.
Yeah, okay. One of the other points that you raised, I guess, as part of the development angle that we were speaking about, was around resource. Are you finding it more difficult to find good people to bring into your organisation, or indeed to retain them? Has there been any impact of COVID and I suppose remote working, I guess, on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It has become more difficult, and COVID, I think, clearly is playing a part in that. It's difficult to say exactly how big a part, but I think there is a clear link across to the new way of working that we're all getting used to or have got used to. So I think initially we felt that this might be an opportunity because as an employer, we could cast our net more widely in terms of recruiting people into roles. But of course, that's a double-edged sword. And people looking for roles in turn can, increase their geographic spread, can't they? Because they're not necessarily commuting to an office every day. So we're seeing that it's becoming more of a market that there are challenges for us in terms of certain key roles, technical roles, and more senior roles in particular, where people have more choice now. And it's making it harder to recruit the right people, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're all finding that across lots of sectors, to be honest. There's lots of vacancies and not enough strong technical people out there in the marketplace. And I think you're right, the flexibility of home working or hybrid working is great, and it gives people that flexibility, but it does come with its downsides as well.
I mean, we have enhanced our benefits package from this year. So we did some work in the lead up to the current financial year to look at how we can attract good people in, and we've got a stronger benefits package in now beyond the the basic salaries and terms and conditions, which I think has been a benefit for us. I think probably as a sector we need to work harder to attract people in to what we're doing and get a stronger hook into our values and our purpose and that sort of thing. It still seems to be a lot of people come into social housing not really knowing what it is. It's just a job that they like the look of, but they don't look beyond that. I think we need to sell the sector ethos and purpose a bit more strongly than we have done in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. They're the things that tie people to an organisation, aren't they? The values and purpose. So it is really important. Okay. And in terms of being back in the office versus working from home, what's been the strategy at PA?
So we decided to be one of the earlier adopters with this. So we did some work last financial year, around 6 months into COVID, to consult with staff, see how they were finding things, what their preferences were. And through that, we introduced from the 1st of April this year what we termed a blended working approach as a permanent change to how we operate. So most of the employment contracts now say that the employee is officially home-based, but with an expectation that they'll keep travelling to the office on a regular basis for team meetings, one-to-ones, connectivity, collaboration, that sort of thing. Broadly speaking, that's been popular with the majority of our employees, and they like the flexibility of a mix of home and office-based working. I think initially for all of us, working at home all the time was a bit of a novelty back in summer 2020 when the weather was nice, but it became more of a grind as we went through the winter, didn't it? You have the dark.
Absolutely. And again.
But in a way, I think, and certainly for me personally, I've started stepping into a pattern now where I'm at home 2 or 3 days a week and I'm in the office 2 or 3 days a week. And I like that sort of breaking up. So you're not in the same place all the time throughout the working week. And in addition to that, we've tried to be much more flexible around how you deliver your hours that you're contracted to. So that old 9 to 5 culture has gone away broadly. And, if people want to say, or need to take some time off of the school run, or if they want to, just spend half an hour walking the dog to clear their head, that's absolutely fine. In agreement with their line manager, they can do that, and they can, complete the work either at the start of the day or later at the end of the day, depending on what their preference is. And for most roles, that tends to work quite well without really too much impact on service delivery.
Yeah, and I think the couple of days in the office, because I think most people were doing the same at BDO as well. I think they're really important. Going back to your earlier point about culture and values, it's quite difficult to instill that when everybody is working remotely, but just having those touch points and building those relationships can be really important in terms of retaining people, I think.
Yeah, but we found, particularly with, as I'm sure most have, particularly with new starters, that it's so much more difficult to get to know the business and what you need to achieve when you're working remotely. And thinking back to times when I've started new jobs, there's no substitute for sitting in the office and just listening to and absorbing what's happening around you. People on phone calls and general conversations and that sort of thing. And that's a really important way of informal learning about the job you're being asked to do. And of course, if everybody's in remote locations, you lose that. You have the Teams meetings or the Zoom meetings, but that's not the same. So we've certainly tried, as we've built our experience of this, we tried to encourage new starters and their teams and managers to meet on a more regular basis to enable those informal conversations to happen and bed people into the business more quickly.
Yeah, okay. And then so finally, in terms of the survey results, from my perspective, one of the things that jumped out was the increase in cyber security that's been required. It's been great to some extent, us all being remote and increasing that flexibility, but it has opened the doors a little bit to cyber crime. What have you found as an organisation? Have you had to do anything different from that perspective?
Yeah, we've ramped up our arrangements, absolutely. Again, our board is all over this, so it's a recurring agenda item at our audit and risk committee meetings, and they take a very keen interest in our arrangements here. I think we have people within the IT team who have built up this specialism, which is really helpful, and we've applied for the various accreditations that are out there. You can never say you'll never suffer an attack. So it's probably more a matter of when rather than if for everybody. Eventually something will get through, but I think we're doing all we can to keep our defences strong. As part of the remote working rollouts, we were planning to introduce Office 365 anyway, and we accelerated that work. And we've wrapped around a very secure security environment around that. So in terms of people using the devices away from the office, I think we've done as much as we reasonably can to keep that secure. So something we never rest on our laurels on, but I think we're in a reasonably good place there, and we're consistently looking for ways to further enhance the security of that working environment. Yeah,
and I think we always have been as businesses, haven't we? Really, it's always been on the agenda, and I think it always will be.
Yeah, but of course, through all this, the cost goes up, doesn't it? So it's another
Absolutely.
cost for us. It's an essential cost, but in terms of things like we've introduced increased penetration testing now in various different ways. So we're asking external experts to try and hack in, or even sometimes blag their way into our systems in terms of contact with staff and that sort of thing. And there's a cost to that, but it's like insurance, isn't it? You don't know when you need it, so it's a price worth paying, I think.
Absolutely. Okay, and just before we conclude, you touched earlier on the impacts of inflation and sort of rent prices within the organisation. Is there anything you'd like to share on those topics?
Yeah, I suppose going back to what I said at the start around business versus residents' needs and priorities, and that's something we're currently grappling with. So our board hasn't made a final decision yet on the rent increase to be applied for next year. Clearly, we're allowed to apply up to 4.1% under the current rules. I think they're very, very aware of the pressures that our residents are under, but equally, they see a duty to preserve the viability of the organisation and capacity to invest into the longer term. I think the other side of the coin there is on service charges, and that's somewhere where potentially you do have a bit more flexibility to accommodate what residents are feeling. So in particular with the utilities costs, potentially they're facing significant increases there to service chargeable costs. And we're asking ourselves the question at the moment, is it the right thing to do to simply pass on those costs in full? Or do we need to think about how we can absorb some of that within the business operations to lessen the burden for residents? And then on top of that, we're looking at whether we can introduce some sort of utilities hardship fund to target residents who live in properties with a lower energy performance certificate rating. And if they can evidence that they're facing significant pressure on their utilities bills, their power bills, then can we do a bit of work in the short term to assist them with those costs while the market is still very volatile. But based on all the economic forecasts that we see, I think we're in for a higher cost inflation environment for probably the next couple of years at least. So this isn't going to go away within the next 6 months. This is with us for a while, and that makes it ever more important the board considers very carefully how they respond to this challenge from both the business and the resident perspective.
Yeah, so it's a fine line of juggling act, isn't it, to get both of those things right, and probably impacts the social housing sector much more than it does others, I would say. Touching back on some of the points we raised earlier under the ESG agenda, and how that's always, the S of that has always been a really important factor in everything that you do.
Yeah, and of course there's no right or wrong answer, is there? The circumstances for each housing association will be slightly different. Yeah. So it's very difficult to apply a one-size-fits-all solution to this. Yeah,
indeed. Is there anything else that was in the survey that we haven't touched upon that you wanted to talk about today, Simon?
I don't think there is, thank you. I think it's been a fairly wide-ranging discussion, so I'm happy to leave it there if you are.
Okay, absolutely. Well, thanks very much for your time. It's been really useful, and it's been really good to hear what's going on from your end.
Pleasure. Nice to talk to you. Thank you.
Andrew, thanks.